Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 90. I'm Steve Kwan, and today we have a returning legend to the podcast from the Isle of Vancouver, the Taint Professor, Robert J. Biernacki.
Jay, oh, that's a new one.
Hey, it works for Trump. It's going to work for you, too.
God, I thought that was a Simpsons reference, like Homer J. Simpson, and J stands for J, like J-A-Y.
Well, I also thought it was a Simpsons reference, but Trump does it as well, doesn't he? I think his middle initial is J, or at least that's the way that he announces it. Maybe he got that from The Simpsons.
Well, I mean,
it really would complete the circle.
He gets his worldview from cartoons, I think. So yeah, fair enough. Okay, let's move on.
So today, a topic that Rob has wanted to talk about for a while, which I think is right up our alley, is the concept of expertise. And, you know, I don't know about you, Rob, but I find myself in the awkward position of having some deluded people out there actually look to me as an expert in certain areas. And with that comes a whole landmine of challenges, both when you're the person who is the authority and when you're the person who doesn't know what they're doing. And part of what we wanted to talk about today is how you can make quality decisions about the type of information that you have in front of you. So when you are confronted with expertise, so when you've got that black belt in the room who's telling you what you should or shouldn't be doing, how do you know that that is actually the best advice? And how do you compare that advice to other sources of advice? And how do you rationalize that if those sources don't agree with each other?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, like, let's be honest, especially nowadays, this is a landmine because, like, I don't really want to talk about politics, but it's kind of difficult to avoid because there has been a concerted effort on the part of one side of politics in particular, in the United States, not elsewhere. There's been a concerted effort to reduce the public opinion of expertise, to create as much doubt as possible about the efficacy of experts. There's a lot more belief in pseudoscience. There's a lot of populist rejection of expertise that has been, like I said, it just increasing over probably the last 30 years. And very much so in the last 5 or 10 years. I'm in my mid 40s and I still remember a time when like scientists were revered. Like, I'm old enough to remember when Carl Sagan was a pretty big celebrity. And we do have Neil deGrasse Tyson nowadays, but I would argue that his footprint is far, far smaller. And even back when Carl Sagan was a big deal, he was writing about the potential damage being done to society by anti-intellectualism in the United States again. Although it's unfortunately, even though I would argue that out of Western countries, the United States has the highest anti-intellectualist sentiment, it is spreading. And so there's been, like I said, a very concerted effort to reduce the impact of expertise because experts are... they're at the forefront of being able to debunk and call out extremely bad ideas. And politics is unfortunately, it's often the organization of bad ideas and trying to present them to people in a palatable way so that you can pretend to be doing something about a problem rather than doing it, while funneling as much power to your donors as you possibly can. So having people who are not beholden to that process, who are just going to say, well, no, that's not really how things work. If you can eliminate their influence on the public, then you can kind of make reality whatever you want it to be. To a point. We're reaching a point in our society, in the world, where people trying to ignore experts is now finally, in a gruesome way, having pretty negative consequences. You can only cheat science and reality for so long. So those chickens are finally coming home to roost. But it's too late. The damage is done because the people who are of the type to reject expertise are now doing so and making the problems that the world faces even worse, and may even prevent proper solutions from being as effective as they can be. You know, the most specific example of that is going to be vaccine deniers, anti-vaxxers, who, depending on what country you're in, and if you look at the statistics on who's going to take a vaccine and who isn't, again, in the States, it's probably higher than almost any other Western country as to people who are saying right off the bat, without knowing anything about it, they're just not going to take a vaccine. So In jiu-jitsu, we are still, as a community, mostly about looking up to experts. But because people who are newer to the community aren't as educated on what expertise looks like, they tend to think that anyone wearing a black belt is an expert in jiu-jitsu, and that is absolutely not the case. So, sorry, like roundabout way of getting to my point here. When you're asking, how do I know if I should listen to the black belt in the room about something, it really, really depends on what their actual field of expertise is. Like, I know black belts who can't defend a heel hook or do a heel hook to save their life. I know black belts who don't know how to do a darce. You know, that's I think that's a bit of a poor standard, but anyway. So if you ask them a question about that, how they answer it will hopefully tell you whether or not they're somebody to be trusted as an instructor, because people who make up answers to questions they don't know the answers to are definitely not to be trusted and are definitely not experts. Because one of the things that's really clear about experts is they're the first ones to tell you when they are speaking outside of their field of knowledge. Like, I have seen interviews with physicists who are asked a physics question and they're like hemming and hawing because the physics question is outside of their particular field. You know, like if the guy's a particle physicist and they get asked about a question that's about, I'm blanking on some other specific type of physics, but they will very much say, well, this is out of my field of expertise, even though they can probably answer that question really, really well. They're aware enough of what other experts actually know about this. And I think that in jiu-jitsu, if you're dealing with a black belt who's never trained with or rolled with actual, real, elite black belts, then they don't know the limitations of their knowledge and they're more likely to be making shit up on the spot. So I would say that the first aspect of like, how do I determine whether or not this person is an expert, whether we're talking about somebody who's wearing a black belt in jiu-jitsu or somebody who's, got a medical degree or somebody who's talking about, any subject, is how willing are they to couch their statements with qualifiers? How willing are they to say, well, this isn't my particular area of expertise. Here's what I know about this. Or, in my field, I'm pretty familiar with this. And based on my experience, and they give you really specific examples. Like one of the first things I tell my students is that anything I teach you in here, I've either personally used like at the black belt level. I've used it in competition against another black belt or in training against good black belts, or I learned it from somebody who used it in competition at the black belt level, uses it against good black belts. That is my standard. That allows me to teach stuff to people that I know has the utmost standard of quality. And when I do teach it to them, I also explain to them that if I can't explain to you why we're doing it, if I can't give you an example of it being used at the black belt level, then I just shouldn't be teaching it. It's not my business to just teach you random shit, and it's not my business to try to tell you that you should do something just because I say. I should have to give you a rationale for it that can be well explained. So if people are doing that and they're saying, oh, look, I've been training for this long and I've played this type of guard for this long, and when this happens, then you got to do this, and when this happens, and they give you a conceptual grounding for it, then yeah, absolutely. You should probably listen to them. If they're saying, well, do it because I say so because I'm the black belt, then that's probably an indicator that they're not that much of an expert.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. There's a lot to unpack there. And I think
I kind of went off on it.
No, it's perfect. I think one of the first things that stands out to me, and something that I think as a beginner, you often aren't really able to see right away, is that just because someone is an expert does not mean they are an expert in every single aspect of what they're teaching in. So, I mean, you gave a great example there of scientists, right? If you are a scientist, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are an expert in all walks of science. It would actually be preposterous to claim that you're an expert in every single wing of science. And even within jiu-jitsu, it's the same thing, right? Everyone has a different journey to how they got their expertise. And that ultimately dictates, like you said, what they know, what they know has worked firsthand for them, and what they don't know. And the important thing from an expert is, if you really are an expert, you should be aware of and comfortable disclosing the limitations of your knowledge. And I think that a big red flag of any jiu-jitsu instructor is the one who has an answer for just everything, regardless of what you throw at them, right? Even if it's outside of their wheelhouse. You know, if you have an instructor who never trains outside of IBJJF rules, but you look at them and they're able to just kind of come up with answers about things that they've never trained, you should at least look twice into that and maybe consider a second source of information. It doesn't mean your instructor is wrong, but it means that they're talking about something that may be outside of their comfort zone. And the challenge to wearing that expert hat is you are often put on the spot where you're kind of being asked of what may be a very difficult question outside of your zone. And, at first your ego kind of kicks in and you feel like you're obligated to provide an answer because, after all, you are the expert. And that leads to a lot of situations where people talk out of turn and they wind up explaining things when they really have absolutely no idea and they're just taking a best guess at the time. That's, I think, one of the challenges with expertise is that for the total beginner, it's very, very hard for them to look at the situation and assess, is this person a true expert? And I think we see that a lot on the world stage, right? Like, if it's one thing for me to look at another black belt and to kind of have an idea of what they know and they don't know, but it's another thing for the first day white belt to show up and have no clue how this martial art even works. And they're being told this information. And it's going to take them a long, long time to be able to parse out who's telling the truth, who's telling what's effective, what works and what doesn't. And I think that's the challenge, is that in order to get to the point where you're actually equipped to judge and qualify whether an expert knows what they're talking about, you kind of, to some extent, have to be an expert yourself, or at least on your way there.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say you have to be an expert, but I would say that you have to have a pretty substantial amount of knowledge. Like, to again, put it into jiu-jitsu terms, the average person walking into the gym for the first time, if they were to roll with one of my blue belts, and then they were to roll with me, they would literally not be able to tell the difference. I've had to explain this to people a couple different ways. Where, like, I've got some really good athletic blue belts who just, like, it's crazy that we really don't have very many good athletes in jiu-jitsu. Like, when somebody who's actually a good athlete, like somebody who's played another sport professionally, and they come in and they start doing jiu-jitsu, you realize how bad the general level of jiu-jitsu is. Because most people who are doing it are just not even remotely athletic. So their learning rate and their physicality is so much lower than that of athletes that, like, when a real athlete comes in, literally people who've been training for 2 or 3 years, the first couple years that they're learning jiu-jitsu, they're just actually learning how to control their body in a non-idiot way. Like, they're learning how to not fall over for no reason. They're learning how to keep their balance. They're learning how to not put themselves into, like, unathletic positions all the time. When somebody comes in with an athletic background, they can just do shit, right? They don't fall down for no reason. They don't have shitty balance. They don't have shitty posture. They don't give people access to breaking their alignment so easily. So when somebody's a pretty good athlete at blue belt, if somebody comes in and just rolls with them, they literally, the rate at which my blue belt can submit a brand new person it's absolutely equal to mine. I cannot, like, there's a rate at which when somebody's just, sticking their arm out every time and you just slap a triangle on them, slap an armbar on them, sweep them left and right. There's literally no way for that person to tell. And it's literally impossible for me. Like, the error rate that the new person is making, it's so high that the mistakes are so big that the blue belt will catch every single one of those mistakes if they want to and submit you. And so I can't even show to a brand new person that I'm actually any better unless I roll with that blue belt. And they'd have to watch me rolling with the blue belt and see what the difference is. So as somebody who is a neophyte to information, it's really difficult sometimes. And unfortunately, like with the jiu-jitsu world, it's really easy to figure out. Like, if somebody is an actual blue belt and the other person's an actual black belt, like, and there's legitimately that level of difference in skill between them, then the blue belt rolling with the black belt is the end of the question. It's the end of the argument. But when you look at other fields of expertise, like if an epidemiologist is talking and a doctor is talking, a doctor who's just like an emergency room doctor or a pediatrician is talking, somebody who has no medical training whatsoever could watch them argue. And again, they wouldn't be able to tell necessarily if the pediatrician or the non-epidemiologist is disingenuous enough and uses enough, sleazy debate tactics, which, if you want to watch sleazy debate tactics by a guy who's full of shit 90% of the time, just listen to Ben Shapiro. You've got a guy who's made a career out of just bad logic and dunking on college students who have no idea how to debate. And people watch him and they think he's the smartest guy on the fucking planet when he's just he's a total hack propagandist. So if you're really interested in debating disingenuously and not actually arriving at the truth, you can cloud somebody else's vastly superior knowledge, especially if somebody's not going to look up some of the information you put out. They're not going to be able to parse like the difference between certain things. It's actually really possible for somebody who is a total expert in the field to still not convince the uninitiated person.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating thing because it is interesting how quickly the machine can come off the wheels when an expert is confronting someone who is just really, really good at deconstructing experts. There is a totally different skill set to that. So yeah, it's one thing to be an expert and it's another thing to be able to create the appearance of expertise. It's the difference between being right versus making yourself look right. And that might sound like it's not a big difference, but it's a huge, huge difference, right? Because there are people who are basically in the category of showmen, and their ability is not necessarily to go through all of the steps required to create and construct these rational thoughts, but they're able to create like a smoke screen that makes their opponent look bad. And by doing that, they're able to sow the seeds of doubt in the minds of people who don't really understand what's going on. So,
well, sorry, I don't want to correct you, but I just want to add an addendum here. You say they're able to make their opponent look bad
in the eyes of someone who doesn't know what they're doing.
Exactly, only in the eyes of the really uninitiated. It's like when people watch certain commentators. When I watch Ben Shapiro, I'm just like, oh Christ, this guy's so full of shit. It's like, it's unbearable. Like if you have some training in rhetoric and you've ever done, like I was on the debate team in high school. So like when you know what a Gish gallop is, when you can recognize the kind of logical fallacies and bad arguments that these guys throw out, watching them is like, oh dude, this guy's a clown. But doing that in real time and recognizing what they're doing and being able to counter it, that's a skill. That's a level of expertise that a lot of people don't have. You usually have to sit down, analyze like each argument one by one in real time. That's just impossible. If you don't actually just go, watch it on YouTube, hit pause after one sentence, and then go check out the veracity of that and think about the actual logical process. If you don't do that, it can be really difficult. So yeah, like I said, it's people who aren't initiated into logic, critical thinking, understanding fallacies, understanding cognitive biases, understanding psychology, and when I say understanding, I don't mean at the level of an expert. I just mean having enough of a background to just kind of recognize what's up. If you understand those things, then you start to become inoculated against this kind of nonsense. But again, through a concerted effort over the course of decades, education has been reduced to a pretty poor state, and so the amount of people walking around out there that have this sort of knowledge just to help guide them in their life and in their decision making, that number is getting vanishingly small when it comes to people who are not, again, specifically in a field that requires it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that a great example of this is jujitsu, right? I mean, we all know that if you want to be competent at jujitsu, you don't need to have a black belt. Like by the time you get to blue belt, you're probably good enough to defend yourself on the street and to also identify if you're fighting someone else who's way, way better than you, right? You have that level of awareness as to what's going on. And it's very similar when it comes to really any area of knowledge. There is the rote beginner who is so inexperienced that they can't even tell expertise versus fake expertise. But then there is a level of training where you might not be an expert yourself, but you at least know enough to be able to call bullshit when you see it. And that is so important when it comes to being able to assess experts in any given field. Like you said, there is really a glut of just fake and competing expertise floating around right now, to the point where I think it's actually overwhelming a lot of real discourse and a real progress. And I think most people would agree with me, regardless of their political leanings, that the current way that we engage and debate each other is just not productive. It's actually very destructive.
Oh, totally. Because these commentators, they exist on like either side. Right? Like I pick Ben Shapiro just because he's one of the worst. Crowder might be the worst example, but like there's a class of propagandists that is basically just funded. They just their job is to poison the well. Their job is to put really bad arguments out there to make it difficult for honest arguments to take place. I haven't ran across as many of them on the other side of the political spectrum, just because I try to avoid watching anything political nowadays. It's painful to watch, because there's, like I said, there's no discourse. There's no actual engagement of ideas. It's just one person lying about what the other person says,
or trying to overwhelm them, which is something you talked about earlier.
Yeah, like the Gish gallop or the fire hose of falsehood methodology.
We should probably actually define that. So for those who don't know, the Gish gallop is one of those things where once you see it and understand it, it kind of loses all of its magic, because you can watch two people arguing and debating, but sometimes you notice there's that one person who just seems to be like driving the other person into the ground with way too many ideas, way too many things for them to come back with. Yeah. And it makes the other person look weak. But what's actually happening a lot of the time in that case is one of those parties, rather than presenting sound and solid arguments, they might just be trying to overwhelm with volume. And where you see this a lot is on, like, especially news pundit talk shows. Like, the thing I hate most is when you've got like the guy from the left and the guy from the right, and they're both just screaming at each other and they're talking over each other, and it's the worst thing. Basically what they're trying to do is Gish gallop each other. A Gish gallop is where you try to win a debate not by merit but by volume, just by overwhelming the other party with so much shit that they can't possibly rebut every single point. So it doesn't even matter if you're right. It matters that you've basically consumed the airspace. And in the eyes of an uninformed person, they're going to see that and be like, whoa, that dude's saying a lot and this other guy's not getting a word in. So, I know who the smart guy is. That's an example of like a really, really toxic debate tactic that sadly it works because most people aren't aware of it. And interesting side note, that kind of mental model scales up to almost every walk of life. I mean, as an example, I work in tech, and there's a very common thing called a denial of service attack. Yep. And that is where, like, if I want to take down your website, people have this hilarious, fantastic version of what they think hacking looks like based on what they've seen in the movies, where like the hacker gets to the keyboard and they just bend the server to their whim, and, they just distort the server and it just like parts open and they can just do whatever they want. That's not often how it works. A denial of service attack is where you don't know the magic password. You don't know the magic way to crack open the box. What you do is you just overwhelm the server with volume. You hit it with like billions of fake requests to the point where the regular millions of requests that come in, the server can no longer tell what's real and what's fake. And so it's not able to answer every question anymore. And that's why sometimes when you go to like Google and there's no response and the page just freezes and you come back 2 hours later and now it works, what might have happened is a denial of service attack. And that is where you are overwhelming by volume. You're winning by volume, not by quality. And again, you see the exact same thing happen when two human beings are talking to each other. It's one of those funny concepts that scales all the way up and all the way down. You can apply it anywhere.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was reading, and I can't remember the general's name, but his essential one sentence description of combat is getting there first with the most.
Yeah.
Like that's who wins. The guy who brings the most force to bear in the quickest amount of time is going to win the majority of engagements. But the thing is, again, for those of you who don't know, the Gish gallop was named after a guy named Gish.
Funny that.
Yeah, who's a creationist, propagandist, debater. So that should tell you all you need to know. Like, when a guy who was trying to argue for fucking creationism came up with a tactic, you should know how disingenuous and full of shit it is. People should be educated enough to recognize that on the spot and be like, oh, that guy's using a Gish gallop. Mm-hmm. He's obviously full of shit. Let's not listen to anything he says. And instead, you got people thinking that he's the cool kid's philosopher. Like, fuck off.
Yeah, I think the big challenge is that the way that you dispel these tactics, like the way that you combat cognitive biases and logical fallacies, is you have to know what they are and you have to develop an awareness of them. That's really the only way to do it. Because once you realize, oh, wait, this is survivorship bias or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It corrects course for your brain and pulls it back on the track of real deep cognitive thinking versus just like reacting with your lizard brain, right? And again, on irony on the topic of expertise, because I know someone will write in and tell us this because they always do. Of course, Rob and I are not psychologists and we're not claiming to be experts in psychology. So it is ironic that we're talking a little bit out of our wheelhouse.
No, but all we're doing is quoting actual experts.
Exactly. This is something that I find very important for people to understand, which is how you engage with experts when you are basically like punching up a weight class. You're talking with someone who is inherently more qualified than you, but you think that they're wrong. The thing is, your gut feeling and your beliefs do not outweigh another person's actual expertise. So if you want to challenge an actual expert, you can do it. And actually, you should do it a lot of the time, but only if you can bring with you the weight of other experts who support you and can prove your point. So an example, if I'm going to talk to someone about COVID or whatever, or about, socioeconomic policy, these are areas I'm not an expert in. So I'm not going to just pull out a bar napkin and start, drawing down exactly how we're going to solve all of the world's problems. But what I can do is I can look at what trusted experts have actually said on the matter, and I can look at what other experts have said about those experts. That's actually a mistake that a lot of people make, is they'll take one piece of information that sounds good to them and they like it because it agrees with them, and then they run with it. What you always want to do when you see a piece of information, especially one that's too good to be true, is find out what the other experts are saying about that person and find out what responses have been issued to that information. And if you find that, like, look, there's a whole bunch of data that backs up what I'm saying, then don't come out and say, hey, this is my idea. This is what I think. What you do is you act as a content aggregator and you present the expertise that other people have already gathered. And that's what we're trying to do here today. I'm not claiming that we have PhDs in psychology or anything, but what I hope that we can do is put into your head some of the ideas that have already been created within these communities that you can then go and investigate more on your own.
Yeah, one of the I'm glad you kind of brought that up, especially the term content aggregator, because one of the things that I've been criticized for by both people who don't know me and people who do know me a little bit is they say that I'm just incredibly intellectually arrogant and that I kind of beat people over the head with this, and I don't respect people's opinions and all that. I'm like, honestly, if you give me an opinion that you formed that has come from some actual expertise, the reason I'm dismissive of people is because when I look into a topic and I read up on what actual experts say, and then somebody disagrees with that, and their source of information is some fucking hack propagandist or some conspiracy theorist or some populist fucking moron, they're like, yeah, I'm going to be dismissive. I'm going to be dismissive because I went to experts and you went to morons. So I shouldn't respect your opinion. There's this notion nowadays that's being it's being popularized that everyone's opinion is equally valid. And not only that, and more dangerously, that opinions are as valid as facts. And I just don't have any patience for that. If you want to have a discussion with me and you want to talk about a topic and you have next to no education on that topic, and you go and you search out a bunch of information that backs up a bunch of preconceived notions or some political dogma or some whatever other like personal belief that you have that you're just trying to reinforce with confirmation bias, and you're getting all your information from a tiny bubble, then yeah, I'm like, at a certain point, it's just going to be like, I'm going to think you're a moron and I'm not going to want to talk to you about that. And if that makes me intellectually arrogant, that's honest. Like, I'm honestly okay with that. I like having conversations with people who are going to be open to actually having their mind changed based on new information. And I like having conversations with people who are able to recognize valid information. I like having conversations with people who are intelligent enough to know what they don't know. I like having conversations with people that are intelligent enough to know where to go to find out about things that they don't know. I'll give an example. I have a friend and I won't get into like who this person is because I don't want to like interrupt their privacy in any way. But I have a friend in the United States, and that's about as much as I'll say, who's pretty deeply religious. And I am not at all religious. And I guess I would say that the atheist community certainly gets its fair share of accusations of being, arrogant and dismissive. And so for people who would apply that terminology to me, just know that as somebody who isn't religious, I have several friends who are very religious, but not only is this person quite religious, I have really extensive conversations with this person on a variety of topics because this person is not a dogmatic religious zealot who gets all their information filtered through a religious lens or the political lens that most religious people tend to view everything through, at least dogmatically religious zealots. So although this is somebody who's a firm believer, who goes to church, who, follows the Bible and all that sort of stuff, they are not closed-minded. They are very intelligent. They have differing views on different topics. They don't have one political side that they follow. They will take ideas from basically anywhere. And like I said, we have wonderful conversations. I enjoy the hell out of talking to this person. If I were truly so intellectually arrogant and dismissive, the fact that somebody was deeply religious would be enough for me to be like, oh yeah, no, I don't need to let me lord my intellectual superiority over this person. But I don't look at it that way. I don't have that kind of intellectual arrogance. What I have is an arrogance about people who are just absolutely unwilling to educate themselves and absolutely unwilling to be open to actual expertise. They have their pet things that they believe in, and they're not willing to abandon them. And that is where I think, as a society, I don't think it benefits us to pretend that the moron who reads nothing but political propaganda or religious zealotry or whatever, that moron has as much, or that moron's opinions have as much weight as not only an expert, but somebody who actually researches what the experts think on a topic. It should be okay to be dismissive of people like that. Those people are what are bringing society down. Those people are what makes it possible for populists and demagogues and authoritarians to gain, seize, and hold power. So yeah, people who are easily convinced by poor arguments should not have their intellect respected.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because I think, just from my experience debating people recently, I've come to a few realizations. And one is that people get their stances intertwined with their personal sense of self, to the point where when you attack one, they think you're attacking the other. So I've found, for example, that if someone posts something and I come to them and I try to fact check it or correct it, they take it as a personal attack. And that makes it really, really hard to have a productive conversation, because usually then they will respond with a personal attack. So this makes it really challenging when someone posts something and they share it out there that is obviously false, and I reply in a completely objective manner and explain why that's false and how I know it and how we can prove it. And then they come back with a personal attack. I think that's a big fundamental misunderstanding about how debate is supposed to work, which is that, look, you can attack a person's ideas without attacking the person themselves. And real intellectual progress comes from constantly attacking each other's ideas, right? And that's something we need to be doing more of. I had a conversation the other day with a guy who was talking about the polarization that we face right now between left and right. And I kind of got thinking, I feel like the real polarization we face is not left versus right. I feel like the real polarization we face is people who think critically versus people who don't.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Because it's funny. I've not put too many overtly political statements out into the world, and despite that, the few things that I have said that could be interpreted as political have had people both on the left and on the right insisting that I'm in the other camp. People who think I'm on the right because I've made comments critical of social justice warriors, and then people who think I'm on the left because I've made comments critical of just idiotic demagogues on the right. Like, you should be able to criticize an idea without being assumed to be of a particular political bent. There's an old Chris Rock special where he talks about this, where he's like, I'm on the right on some stuff, I'm on the left on some other stuff. If you find that you're entirely on one side of a political spectrum, that's a pretty good indicator that you're not a critical thinker.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, Rob, I know if there's one logical fallacy that you love, it is false dichotomies.
Well, that's exactly, yeah.
Exactly. I think what you're describing here is dichotomous thinking, right? Which is the tendency where people basically assume that it's very much like black or white thinking. You're either with me or against me. And so therefore, if I say something that disagrees with you, I am then presumed by you that I'm in the other camp and therefore I'm your enemy. And it's interesting because I don't think where we live in Canada, we've got 5 or so major political parties. So I don't think we see it exactly the same. But down in the States, where there literally are basically 2 parties, right? It very much does come down to that with us or against us mindset. And it just seems like it's hard for people to have nuance on anything anymore. And I see this a lot where people kind of, when it comes to how they assess other people or how they assess ideas, is either I embrace the whole thing or I throw out and reject the whole thing. There isn't a lot of room for nuance in people's thinking anymore. And that's unfortunate because a lot of the time, the big gains you're going to have and the big breakthrough understandings is when you put out an idea and you butt heads with someone else. And then you realize that like 50% of your idea was right and 50% of their idea was right. And there's a better idea that can be made by merging the middle ground. I mean, that's not always the case, right? Some ideas are just, like you said, they're inherently preposterous. Yeah. But in a lot of cases, the big gains come from like basically making ideas fight like Pokemon, right? Figuring out who's the strongest and helping them evolve together. That's, I think, the best strategy when it comes to how you refine your thinking. And it's hard to do that in a super tribal environment, especially one where the concept of expertise has been so muddled and so confused, and people don't really have the tools anymore to assess it.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier confirmation bias, which is something that, everyone deals with confirmation bias. Even if you are fully aware of what it is, you're going to catch yourself doing it every once in a while, right? Basically, it's the premise that you are more likely to find and embrace information that agrees with what you already believe, and you're going to be more skeptical of information that disagrees with what you believe. So unfortunately, this means that we kind of funnel ourselves into being more entrenched in our beliefs, where what's probably better in most cases is to keep an open mind. But that can be hard because sometimes our brain works against us. We want to find information that qualifies what we already believe. It makes our ego feel good. It gives us a kind of a stable sense of self and of our moral compass. But in reality, sometimes you kind of need to be slapped in the face with ideas that, they might confront everything you believe in, but actually you realize there's a little bit of merit to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually thinking when you were talking about the false dichotomy thing, because I do want to try to bring this back to jiu-jitsu parallels as much as possible so that people don't turn this episode off. The best example of that is the gi versus no gi debate, and people who want to be no gi only and people who want to be gi only. And it's just a stupid debate.
But you would agree that you and your kind are a bunch of idiot flat earthers, right?
Well, what's my kind there?
You filthy, greasy, slimy no-gi people.
But so why do you think that I'm a no-gi person?
I'm just fucking with you.
Okay. Yeah, because I train in the gi, I train in no-gi. They're excellent merits to both. This idea that one is better than the other and one is more realistic than the other. One's better for self-defense and all this kind of oh fuck. It's just such a tiresome, silly debate. There are merits to both. They develop different aspects of your grappling, and to be a truly knowledgeable, well-rounded grappler, you do need to do both. So.
Yeah, I do actually see dichotomous thinking a lot in jiu-jitsu. I saw some guy debating the other day about basically critiquing an instructional and saying it was garbage. And basically it came down to, well, the competitors that I like and that I follow don't use this technique. so therefore it must be bad. And it's like, dude, that's not at all a good way to assess whether something is going to be good or bad, right? There are myriad factors which are much more qualified for making a decision like this versus, well, my guy does it versus your guy does it, right? That's really not a good way to choose your information.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the sign of either a limited intellect or a young intellect that hasn't experienced enough in life. And one thing, just because I haven't found like an easy segue for it, so let me just kind of bring it out as the idea of like one notion that is used more than any other to undermine or undercut confidence in experts is this idea that, well, this person was wrong, or this information that was put out earlier on is now different. So the expert said one thing at one point and they said another thing at another point. Therefore, they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Just to give an idea of how stupid this is, you know, jiu-jitsu is an evolving art. Something that we would have said 10 years ago, whereas like, hey, this is how you want to do a heel hook. Now we're going to say, well, okay, that's actually not the best way to do it. You're going to want to do it this way. So, you know, if I 5 years ago or 6 years ago said, hey, there's this way to do a heel hook. And then I go and I train with Eddie Cummings, who's revolutionizing the world of heel hooks. And now I come back and I'm like, hey man, yeah, I was wrong then. Or like, you know, wrong in the sense that like I wasn't wrong then, because then the best information we had available was this is how you do a heel hook. The art has changed, it's evolved, it's developed. We've got some new information that's been added. So now I'm going to tell you this is the best way to do a heel hook. Guess what? The way that Eddie Cummings said to do a heel hook 5 years ago, Eddie Cummings, 3 years ago said, well, no, it's better now this way. And so on and so on. So, and the same thing could be applied to any number of other techniques. Like the best way to do a berimbolo has changed since nobody knew what the fuck a berimbolo was. And if you just kind of knew a basic version of it, you could clown people left and right. Nowadays, you got to be pretty advanced with like a berimbolo system to even expect to be effective with it. So much so that Keenan Cornelius kind of trolls people and says that berimbolo doesn't work. We don't have an issue with that in jiu-jitsu. No one's like, well, who the fuck is Eddie Cummings to talk about heel hooks? He's not an expert. He said this in 2015. He said something else in 2017. Therefore, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like that just shows you how absurd that line of thinking is. But you'll take somebody who said something a few months ago when we understood less about COVID, and now they're giving you different advice. And therefore, that just means that that scientists don't know what they're talking about. You know, scientists at one point said it wasn't healthy to eat this, and now they're saying it's not healthy to eat that. Well, I can't keep up. You know, it was this, and now it's that. Well, if you can't keep up with changes in recommended, like, dietary habits over the course of 10 years, then, like, I don't know what to tell you. if that's such an overwhelming effort to just be like, oh yeah, maybe I should change, maybe I should not eat eggs as much now. Like if that's enough to throw your whole world upside down and now you just don't know what to believe from scientists, then maybe you're just a fucking idiot and you should probably not vote or procreate.
Well, I can relate to it, right? Because the thing that is fundamentally different is the average person spends only a tiny fraction of their attention on these scientific matters, whereas the experts are spending like basically every working moment on these matters. So for us, you know, it's just a little distraction and a nuisance when we have to pull this new information into our head because it's something that isn't really a priority for us. Whereas for an expert, it's their job, right? They live in this world, so they're always on top of these things. And I think actually this is even more of a reason why it's important to lean on expertise when you can find it, because it is hard to keep on top of information in an ever-changing world. If it is not your job to do so, you're probably not going to have the time to do it effectively, which is actually all the more reason why you should lean on expertise, because these people are the ones who are doing that thinking so that you don't have to.
Yeah, but so this is the thing. We all do this when it comes to any number of things. The only area that we don't really do this is in the like higher level beliefs and like the political sphere, because all these people who are like, fuck experts, if their computer breaks, they go take it to somebody who works on computers. They don't bring it to their buddy who works on cars. and has them hit it with a wrench a couple times to get it to work, right? Like, we all have these fundamental automatic responses that like, oh, I've got this thing that's not working. I'm going to go to this person whose job it is to deal with that shit. But when it comes to a political belief, I'll go to some fucking hack propagandist and believe what they say, and end up rabbit holing to one end or the other of the political spectrum rather than just trying to get good information, not from political pundits, but from actual experts. And this is the thing that's really important to start to qualify, is like when we talk about expertise, people who talk about politics are not experts. They are either failed entertainers or they're political operatives that are lying to you. They're not experts. The people that you see on CNN or Fox, any number of these are not experts. They throw out massive proclamations that are almost always reliably wrong, and they're literally there to fill a void. They're there to fill hours on television or on the internet or whatever. Listening to these people rots your brain. Like, just fucking stop. There is expertise in the sense of, if you want to look at the consequences of a political policy, if you want to take a particular policy initiative and go, okay, this particular law changed this, and the consequences of that were this, and this was studied by, actual scientists, and we found that what happened as a result was this. And then you can say, okay, well, that was a stupid policy. Let's maybe not repeat that. If your version of listening to experts on politics is listening to some fucking clown whose solution for everything is a flat tax, then, you're going to end up way on one side with a whole bunch of ignorant and unfounded beliefs. Or all the way on the other side, thinking that fucking communism is a good idea. It's really frustrating because the degree to which this stuff is politics has not impacted my life for the most part in my adult life. I'm somebody who never voted. I'm apolitical because there's not a single politician that I've ever heard speak that represents me on almost any issue. So I've been able to kind of stay out of it for the most part. But now, with what's happening recently, health-wise, and just what's happening when it comes to democracy being subverted in democratic countries over the last half decade or so, it's really frustrating to see how many people fall for this dichotomous bullshit.
Something that you mentioned earlier on was the fact that people look at changing information or people who have changed their minds as some sort of weakness, which is a weird thing to think about, right? But you hear this a lot, like, well, you changed your mind on this, you changed your mind on that. How can I know you're right now? And I've always found that to be an odd line of attack because, as you grow and evolve as a human being, don't you want to evolve your knowledge? If you're 50 years old and you look back on the person you were when you were 20 and you're the exact same person with no change, would you be proud of that? I would be humiliated, right? If you fail to learn anything and evolve your thinking in 30 years, I'd be humiliated. But when it comes to the way that expertise is presented, we seem to have, and I don't know if there's a formal thing for it. I've always just called it a certainty bias, but we seem to be attracted to people who can promise certainty. And I think that's why I've noticed this a lot of the time. When you look for the people who are hucksters and you look at the way they present information, everything is 100% certain. There is no room for doubt in the statements they make. Here is exactly the way things are. Here is exactly what happened. And they're consistent. They'll hold that opinion for 10, 20, 30 years without evolving it. And some people look at that as a sign of strength, whereas in reality, I would see that as a sign of flawed thinking because it means you're not absorbing new information.
Yeah, no, I think the quote, and I can't remember who it was, but it's the problem with the world is that the wise are filled with doubt, whereas fools are filled with certainty.
Yeah, and certainty is attractive, and I understand that because it promises stability in a time where you might not have that. And additionally, I think there's an element where people look at those who are certain and they look at that as like a type of conviction or a type of strength, but really that's misattributed, right? Certainty to the point where you refuse to process and change your mind based on new information, that's a weakness for sure. And we do very much see this in jiu-jitsu as well. But I think the main difference, you talked about how jiu-jitsu has been thankfully somewhat clear of these issues. I think a big part of it is because in jiu-jitsu, you can choke someone the fuck out, right? Like it's hard to carry around a whole bunch of bad fake information and fake techniques for too long, because eventually you're going to have to roll with someone.
Well, but so this is where, again, if we're talking about how do we assess whether somebody is an expert, if the black belt at your school avoids rolling with visitors, if the black belt at your school doesn't go and travel and roll with people outside of their affiliation, that is a sign that they are trying to create a bubble. The same way that if somebody only holds right-wing opinions or only holds left-wing opinions, that means that they've created an intellectual bubble. Although the word intellectual is probably not the right word there. They're creating a knowledge bubble. They're creating a belief bubble that allows them to not have to face new information or opposing information other than the caricature of it that's given to them by their fellow bubble participants. So if we're talking about how do we assess expertise, again, that's a really good jiu-jitsu indicator. Is you've got a black belt at your club, he talks about this or that, but he doesn't roll. And when I say he doesn't roll, there's this one of these like red flags that you'll get from if you go and you ask a question on a forum about how do I know there's a McDojo. One of the red flags is the black belt doesn't roll. The thing is, if you're at a garbage club, the black belt has nothing to fear from his students because he's a shitty teacher. He's teaching them bad jiu-jitsu. They're not going to know that he sucks. So it's not like they have to avoid rolling with their students. Like I said, they'll avoid rolling with visitors, or they'll not have visitors at their club, or they won't roll outside of their affiliation. Because do you really think that, like, if you're paying somebody thousands of dollars a year, and they're being flown in to like promote people and all that, you think they're going to come in and roll with you and like clown you? They're not. Like I've rolled with a couple people who trained at a pretty clown shoes club. And when they rolled with me, they're like, man, you're really good. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, man, I've rolled with plenty of black belts. And like, none of them did to me what you did. And I'm like, well, were they all from your club or were they all from your affiliation? Because your club sucks. Your head instructor's a joke. So if the only black belts you've rolled with are black belts within that like lineage, then of course you think I'm really good, because like I'm actually a decent black belt, but I'm nowhere near as good as you think I am. Because if you think I'm so fucking amazing, it just tells me that you haven't been exposed to like real elite level, like competition black belt jiu-jitsu. Because if you had been, because like this guy was a purple belt, right? Like he should have known, and it was like a very experienced purple belt. So yeah, like he should have known, but yeah, it's if you find that your quote unquote expert doesn't have contact outside of their bubble, if they're not exposed to contrary information and don't have the ability to present an effective counterpoint to that contrary information, then you might be dealing with a horseshit black belt, or you might be dealing with a bullshit expert out there in the world.
Yeah, I think in the past you called that inbred jiu-jitsu, which I thought was an awesome name.
Yes, that's exactly what I call it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that applies to really any type of idea, right? It is inherently comfortable to put up a bubble to protect yourself from criticism and feedback because it can be painful. But the problem is if you do that, then you're denying yourself growth opportunity. And you do very much see this in gyms, where some gyms are just very, very self-contained. You don't have visitors going into or out of those gyms. They only train with people within their own affiliation. And over time, that branch of the tree is going to get weaker, just because without constant exposure to outside stimulation, there isn't going to be that pressure for everyone to get better. There isn't going to be exposure to new ideas. Some of those new ideas might add a lot to the game, or they might punch holes in the old stuff. You're not going to get that if you close your ears to those new ideas. So that is one of the challenges when it comes to kind of like assessing expertise, is you kind of have to look at your expert, in this case, your black belt, and just look at their pattern, look at their behavior. We talked earlier about certainty and how it's important that a good instructor they'll be honest about what they know and they don't know, but also you have to look at how they expose themselves to new ideas, right? Because an instructor who lives in a cave and doesn't talk to anyone else or share information, that's not going to be a very good instructor, at least not for long.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing exists in any field. It's not just jiu-jitsu instructors. I know an engineer who says the same thing. He's like, we've got guys at our firm who they got their engineering degree in the 80s and they haven't gone out and learned another another single thing. And that's why, they've got the same desk that they had 30 years ago, and this guy is now a managing partner in the engineering firm despite being 20 years their junior, is because he kept growing, he kept developing, et cetera, et cetera. So this isn't just a jiu-jitsu thing. If one thing I should mention is because we're kind of, we're shitting on these bad black belts. There's nothing inherently wrong with not trying to be the best. It's just that this is always my issue with these types of black belts, is that rather than admit that hey man, we don't necessarily offer the best jujitsu. This is what we can offer you. If you want something else, you should go somewhere else. They will try to dress it up, usually as, well, we teach self-defense jujitsu, or, we teach the real, classical Helio Gracie filter jujitsu, or whatever
pure
bullshit.
Jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, the pure jujitsu, whatever bullshit marketing term. And they'll do that to obfuscate rather than admit that what they're actually selling you is literally an inferior product, which again, what marketing person is going to say that it's an inferior product? But it doesn't have to be inferior, because not everybody wants the best level of instruction. Some people just want to go and, kind of train, right? And just hang out with their friends. And that's totally fine. But be upfront about it, and don't use this bullshit term of well, they're a hardcore competition school and we're more of a self-defense school. No, what you offer is kind of lousy jujitsu. You're not a self-defense school, because you've locked yourself away from progress. You teach watered down jujitsu. This idea of this pretending that modern jujitsu is inferior to classical self-defense jujitsu that is one. If we want to have an actual dichotomy as opposed to a false dichotomy, that's a pretty actual one. The people who are presenting this notion that jiu-jitsu in the 90s was as good as it was ever going to get, that's a pretty specious argument, and a pretty disingenuous one. Again, it'd be one thing if somebody who is actually going out and competing at the highest level turned around and was like, listen, all I do is use this, and people hold Roger Gracie up as an example of that, whereas he's not using the exact same methodology to do the armbar from the guard that was being done in the 90s. When you watch him teach the armbar, he's like, look, I used to do it this way and now I do it this way. And, in another 5 years, it'll be this way. It'll be I've changed quite a bit about stuff that I learned years and years ago. And I'm I've had to revisit it and go, man, that stuff's just out of date. I gotta get sharper at this, sharper at that. And it's usually shit the armbar from the closed guard. So this idea that there's some pure form that existed back in the day that is just superior, it's just flat out wrong. And if you want to put this into an interesting kind of framing, there's a concept that I believe that the term is called stasis versus dynamism. And I don't remember for sure, but I want to say that the author of this book is Virginia Postrel, and the book is The Future and Its Enemies. And it was the first book that I read that basically said that, other than the ideologues and extremists, you can kind of forget about the left-right paradigm, and what you want to really look for is stasis versus dynamists. So people that are comfortable with things changing, people that are comfortable with chaos and complexity and new ideas coming around and changing the status quo are dynamists. And people who want to exert an excessive amount of control, who don't want things to change, who are super suspicious of new information, are stasists. So, if you look at it as conservative versus liberal, that's not a really good way of looking at it. If you look at it left versus right, that's not really a good way of looking at it, because there's certainly conservatives who don't ever want anything to change. And if that's the only definition that you use, then but then why would anyone want to be a conservative, right? Like the definition that I like to use is, if you're conservative of the kind that isn't an ideological moron, if you're conservative, it just means that you want to use things that work and systems that work until they can be replaced by something that is provably better.
Mm-hmm.
But even if that's your way of viewing things, there still has to be a method for proving that a new thing is better. So if all you are is somebody who just doesn't ever want anything new to get tried or developed, then you're a statist. And if you're okay with new things coming along, even if they contain risk, right? Like a new medical procedure comes about. And like, I think the example in the book was somebody who developed, I don't know if they developed contact lenses. I think that might have been it. And they basically experimented on themselves. Like they stuck shit into their eyes. And I might be getting this wrong. So please look it up. But basically the idea is like at certain points in time, if you want to have development, you have to have risk. So you have to have a certain level of comfort with uncertainty. And so in every endeavor, rather than look at it as a left-right dichotomy, a more helpful one is the one between stasis and dynamism. I can't remember for sure, but I believe the thrust of the book was that dynamism is the way to go, and stasis is what holds everything back. And I don't think that that's necessarily accurate, because I think there are definitely times when stasis is probably more valid and times where dynamism is more valid. In the same way that sometimes, being a little bit more conservative is more valid, and sometimes being a little bit more risk-taking is more valid. The way that societies are formed, institutions are formed, is on the interplay between those two things. So you have a company that's growing extensively and incorporating new technology, and if it goes too far in that and it overextends itself, then let's say there's a market crash, then it might go bankrupt. And then you have a company that's conservative and it'll survive that market crash because it's got more established assets. But then in the longer term, if you've got a company that's so conservative that it refuses to adopt new technology, eventually the new technology becomes so good that it makes that company's technology obsolete, and that company goes away without a market crash because it was too conservative. So again, it's all kind of found in the interplay and in the balance. And sometimes you need one and sometimes you need the other. So sorry, it's just something I thought would people would find helpful when it comes to assessing expertise and information.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And this is actually something I've always kind of felt, which is when people identify as I am left wing or I am right wing, I've kind of thought of that and thought to myself, well, would you always be that way? Are you so married to that idea that there's no situation where the other approach might be more valid? I think honestly, the best approach to have when it comes to your leanings like that is to be kind of like a pendulum where you move back and forth and pick the best tool for the moment, right? Because you gave two great examples. When the economy is on the rise, you might want to pursue a more aggressive growth strategy. Whereas when you're in a recession, then you might want to batten the hatches, right? These are different strategies. And if you stick to the exact same strategy, regardless of what's happening around you, you're probably not going to achieve optimal results, to say the least. Something else that you talked about was the example of people who kind of just never evolve and grow in their career. And that reminds me of a lesson I learned a long time ago, which is that expertise and experience are not the same things. And people often get them conflated and confused, and they might think they're an expert when they're not. They just have experience. You can have a situation, for example, where someone is, maybe they've climbed the ladder and over 10 years they become CEO at a company, but they might not be the most experienced person at the company. There could be people working on the accounting department who have 20 or 30 years working with the company. Would you want those people to make decisions on behalf of the CEO because they have more experience? Probably not, right? I mean, experience is only valuable if you learn from it and grow from it. The saying that I've heard is, would you rather have 20 years of experience or would you rather have 1 year of experience 20 times? And I think that's a great way to think of it. And I think what happens sometimes is people who have a lot of experience erroneously think that they're actually experts just because of time spent. Right? I mean, just because, I've been around for so long, therefore I'm an expert. Well, not really. If you've just kind of been going through the motions and doing the same thing for 30 years.
Jiu-jitsu is very, very bad for this, right?
Oh, definitely.
How many black belts are wearing black belts simply because they showed up for 10 years. It's probably at this point the majority of them. And when I say the majority, I mean it's probably over 50%.
Oh, I would agree with that. I think that's probably true.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a very good example where just because someone has a black belt, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're awesome, right? I mean, there could be people in the gym who have way less time on the mats than they do, but are actually a lot better just due to the way that they use it. Also, a lot of it is not just time on the mats. It's the entrenchment in your thinking, right? If you as a black belt really haven't progressed in terms of your learning and your mental models much since you were a white belt, you're stunting your growth. Whereas you might have someone who just, a lot of the time we call them like prodigies, but a lot of it might just be being effective thinkers and being better at absorbing information. You can wind up having people who are more junior, but are actually better coaches than the people who are black belts for sure.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Like that's definitely the case. Like, I guess I'm a bit of an iconoclast in jiu-jitsu with this topic of rank, because there is this overwhelming belief that like everyone can get a black belt. And I actually don't believe that everyone can, just because I think that if you make something too accessible, it becomes meaningless. First of all. Second of all, this idea that it's impossible to actually have universal rank standards, I don't think is accurate. When I say universal, I don't mean like every gym's got their own standards and people say that. But I did a podcast recently with Harrison. I'm going to mispronounce his last name. It's Helterbrand. It's the Old Rollers podcast. And we talked quite a bit about curriculum and rank. And he mentioned to me that after listening to the podcast, he got an email from a black belt who fortunately found it really illuminating and helpful, because this black belt had always felt like he had a very good idea of how to judge when somebody was a blue belt from white belt. And he had a pretty good idea of how to judge when somebody was a purple belt. But he didn't really feel like he had a good concrete idea of what would make someone a brown belt or a black belt. And this despite being very experienced, as you would say, like having 20 years of experience. Mm-hmm. And he just found that the rubric that I gave for how to make rank more universal and more transparent and more well thought out, but at the same time modular. Like one of the things that I hate was like, well, if you're a black belt, it means you know these techniques. No, that's stupid. But there are overall skill sets that you should possess. And as long as you stay within that, I think you can come up with a pretty realistic expectation of what a black belt should know and be able to do. And again, the idea that you're always going to be able to execute that knowledge, that's not true, because obviously if you're a 50-year-old black belt with, a knee surgery recently who weighs 150 pounds and you're rolling with a 200-pound roided up 25-year-old purple belt, you're not going to be able to execute all that stuff. So there are modifiers. There are ways to figure it out. And like, if anybody's interested in checking out that podcast, check out the Old Rollers. You can search it. I think it's on YouTube and whatever other like podcast services, because I don't want to like just rehash that. But if you want to really sit down and try to apply some logic and some modularity and some thinking to it, we can absolutely come up with a way of assessing whether or not somebody is what we would call a legit black belt. So this isn't as mysterious as it should be. But in our community, there's this whole idea that like, nobody can comment on rank and it's kind of silly. So I know I'm a little bit in the minority that way, but I do believe that there are people who, despite having a ton of years, for one, they don't have as much mat time. Usually you talk about a hobbyist black belt, somebody who shows up, twice a week for 10, 12, 15 years and they get a black belt. The amount of mat time that guy has is actually less than a purple belt who's been training for 6 years and shows up 5 days a week. So, somebody who's like, well, yeah, but look, that purple belt is a better instructor and is more knowledgeable than that black belt. Therefore, that invalidates the rank system. Well, no, it's just the way that it's applied is a little bit invalidated by that. Because if you look at it purely from like valid experience and expertise perspective, that purple belt should maybe be a black belt. And that black belt definitely shouldn't be a black belt.
Mm-hmm. It's a tricky one. I mean, a while ago, we did an episode where we talked about promotions, and basically we kind of outlined some of the different ways that different instructors outlined the path to black belt or whatever. And it is interesting how there is no real universal standard. I mean, I know that what you're proposing is to move towards one. This is an interesting conversation because I don't know if there is a right answer. I mean, my personal beliefs on the matter, I don't really put too much thought into it. What I do rather, and I think actually this is an important thing for people to understand, is rather than getting too distracted by the symbol of authority, it's better to understand the ideas behind it.
But that's what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that what we have now is an obfuscated path to black belt. So you have this way of appearing to be an expert without having to clearly state how you got your expertise. Mm-hmm. You can just say, well, I'm a black belt under so-and-so, and if you got a problem with that, take it up with him.
Yeah.
This idea of lineage is now basically used to sweep under the rug some hellaciously shitty black belts. Mm-hmm. What I want is for people to be able to know when somebody's wearing a black belt that they got it for these reasons. You know, that they actually are an expert because they've invested the time. Like, I think a black belt should be like a PhD. You know, when you get your PhD, you got it for this. You have your dissertation or your whatever. Is it a dissertation?
Your thesis?
Thesis. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Obviously not a PhD.
Yeah, obviously. Exactly.
Well, here's the thing that I think. I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to what the black belt means to you. Like for me, I mean, I've never really thought of the black belt as this big meaningful symbol. And I think that's why I'm pretty laissez-faire about the whole thing. I mean, I very much prefer the old school approach of like a black belt is just a signifier of competence.
But that's never been the case in jiu-jitsu. In judo, the black belt was a signifier of competence.
Right.
In jiu-jitsu, if we go back a little while, the black belt was, I don't want to be the back in the day guy, but back in the day, if you got a black belt, you were a bad motherfucker. But that was true for karate too, right? Like, if you got a black belt in karate in like the 50s and 60s, and maybe even still in the 70s, you could fight. And then after the 80s, karate strip mall explosion, you got a black belt if your mom paid the fees for a year and a half and you were 12, mm-hmm. right? Like, so this idea of it, it being a symbol of competence, I'd be fine with it if that's all it ever meant in jiu-jitsu, but it didn't. And so what we're doing is we're creating, again, this false picture of this aspirational thing where like, oh, I'm a black belt, therefore, but you didn't go through the process of what it meant to be a black belt back then. And so I just would like us to be honest about that. If we're going to do it, if we're going to say that a black belt, it just means you're kind of competent at jiu-jitsu, then that's fine. That's absolutely fine. I have no issue with that.
Well, I would caveat a few thoughts on top of that. I mean, I know what you're talking about. Kind of back in the day, like a black belt was basically like a certified Street Fighter symbol. Like it meant that you were a legitimate fighter. Yeah. But that said, I mean, you look at those same black belts today, would you go to those same people who are now well into red and black belt and beyond, and would you take their advice? Because they did earn that black belt legitimately, but does that symbol still hold its meaning?
No, but that's because they stopped evolving.
I guess the question is, like, is it okay if the system evolves, and how much weight do we really need to attach to that black belt? I mean, for me, again, the way that I've had black belt described to me, one definition I really liked is that it is a marker of your personal growth. That to me has been the best explanation I've heard. And part of the reason I like it is it does imply that anyone technically can get a black belt. Doesn't imply that they will, because like it's within your realm. That's not to say that you need to be like a world champion in order to earn a black belt. You can theoretically get a black belt through whatever path makes the most sense to you. But if you achieve that rank, then there is a level of growth in the art and personally that is expected of you, right? If you're basically not growing and evolving to that point, then you would never hit that milestone. But of course, it's a hard discussion to have because like you said, I don't know if there is a right answer. I don't even know if actually in the context of jiu-jitsu, we need something like that. I mean, the thing is, I know that we look at PhDs and you're kind of holding that up as a competitive standard, but mm-hmm. the reality is like PhDs in terms of quality are all over the map. There's a lot of people who have PhDs who would fall under kind of your category of like shitty black belts, right? It's impossible to have a totally universal standard for something that I think is so subjective, isn't it?
I'm not suggesting that we have a totally universal standard that is rigid. I'm saying that what we want is a common definition, because if we're going to use the definition that it's a marker of personal growth, then it just has no validity. Like it just has no validity as far as assessing skill level if it's a marker of personal growth, because you're going to have people who are just not at all able to meet any sort of standards for skillful rolling or knowledge or conveying information, that they've been showing up for 10 years and they're better than they used to be, and they showed some dedication.
Well, I mean, to be clear, I'm taking skill and teaching ability as part of that definition. Like, basically, you need to be at the point where, I mean, I don't want to say you've maxed out, but like you've achieved the level of requisite knowledge, teaching ability, and skill to the point where kind of like, I think for me, if you were to ask me what the big thing is that differentiates a black belt from like a brown belt, it's the ability to create the next generation. To me, that's the most important thing. Like the ability to be an ambassador for the art, to have integrity, to have character, and to be able to teach and produce other black belts. I think that is like the big difference between a black belt and a brown belt.
Well, but if we're going to use that as a standard, then all of the guys that I complain about, they wouldn't be black belts either.
Oh, I'm not defending. Please do not take this as some sort of like defense of like garbage black belts all over the world. Like I totally get that there is a very Mickey Mouse standard of black belts that are out there. I guess it comes down to how important do you feel the black belt is? Because I think the main thing is, for me,
the problem is that people speak out of both sides of their mouth with it. Belts don't matter, but oh my God, I didn't get promoted. What am I doing wrong?
Yeah, definitely.
If we just had a more honest discussion about it and set up a more forthright standard, a more transparent, again, it doesn't have to be completely universal and inviolate, and like you obviously you can't have that. I don't know, like when we say that like there's no universal standard, like for example, if you want to be a pilot, is that something that we would say like, hey man, when you earn your wings, it's a marker of personal growth. Whatever you're like, maybe you're not that good at, landing the plane, but you've been taking these lessons for a while, and it's a marker of personal growth. You've kind of maxed out. You're as good as you're going to be. So here you go. Go out and fly planes now.
Oh, that's not my interpretation at all. I mean, my full expectation is that a black belt should be totally competent at jiu-jitsu. I'm just saying that my expectation would not be that a black belt should be able to go out and just like smoke competition level blue belts or purple belts or brown belts, regardless of all other factors. Like what I'm saying is that your path on the journey and relative to where you started
So first off, let me just say this. I think the idea of having competition level blue belts, purple belts, and all that is a little bit silly.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the idea that you can call yourself a blue belt world champion it makes our sport seem clown shoes to people from the outside. Because if you were to say, hey, I'm the judo Olympic champion at yellow belt, like it sounds ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea that, we've got these totally full-time practitioners who are competing at these lower ranks, like it's just completely absurd. We need to have a designation for professional jiu-jitsu so that you don't have these guys who've got literally more mat time than a lot of black belts, and even a lot of good black belts. And then I'll never mind the clown shoe ones. And they're still competing at blue belt, and they're going out and running like highlight reels on some poor hobbyist blue belt because we've got no distinction. Like I said, it just makes the sport seem incredibly clown shoes.
I see. So let me explain where I'm kind of coming from here when I kind of talk down on the belt system. For me, my main concern with the belt system is, and I think you've already touched on this earlier, it just reeks of authority bias. Like it's really, really easy for people to make decisions based on belt. And that, like you said, at the competition level, that absolutely happens, even in situations where it is a totally preposterous way of organizing things. And my preference, if I were the guy with a magic wand who could totally make all of the decisions, would be abolish the belt system. Basically, I guess my strategy is I don't see a lot of value in it. I think that actual on-the-job performance is a lot more important than the shiny title, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess my thing is that I would rather on the job performance be how you get your title. So that's,
I think probably what I would like to see is something kind of more akin to wrestling, where it is generally flat in terms of title, but there also is like a hierarchy that establishes as you move up divisions. That's a system that I think is a lot better. It's kind of like a compromise of both worlds, because I agree with you 100%. And tying back to the beginning of this episode, you get black belts who speak out of turn on a variety of matters simply because they have this black belt, which, as we've established here, in a lot of cases doesn't mean that much, right? Like at a lot of gyms, getting a black belt just comes down to the number of holes on your punch card. And I'm not even really equipped to say that's a bad decision, but like if that's what a black belt is, then that's what it is. But it's definitely a bad decision for deciding if someone was an expert. Like a good comparative example would be if a PhD simply required you to go and sit in a chair at school for 10 years without having to produce anything of value, like would we still consider a PhD to be a useful title? We don't have the equivalent of a thesis in jiu-jitsu where you create like your magnum opus that expands the knowledge of the world, your contribution that gives back to everyone. And that is the thing that earns you that black belt. And that's how you know you're a legit black belt. We don't really have that. A black belt could mean anything. And that is one of the challenges to relying on it as a symbol of rank, and why I think currently, at least, you generally shouldn't do that.
Yeah, well, again, I think we've kind of deviated a little bit. I'll just, because rather than going around in circles about this, all I would say is that I think that the way that I've presented the solution, I think is a pretty good one, because it does create maybe not a thesis, but it shows how you can build a grappler from white belt to black belt with expanding knowledge, ability to teach, well-roundedness, and modular skills that don't have to be a locked-in curriculum of techniques that I think do a pretty good job of creating a black belt. And I think anyone that has been exposed to my black belts versus, let's say, my brown belts or my purple belts, both in like my home academy and just, affiliates, they'll be able to see that really clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I'm most kind of proud of about how we do rank at our academy is it's not my like subjective Rob knows all decision. In fact, when we have promotion ceremonies, it's not uncommon for me to be like, okay, everybody, who do you think's getting their purple belt? Or who do you think's a bit overdue for their purple belt? And they'll be like, that guy. And that's the guy getting promoted.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, it's definitely, it's something that can be made a lot clearer if you just spend a little time on like designing it and you're willing to have the power taken out of your hands. I consult with my assistant instructors. It's a deliberative process, and the standards are very clear, and it's obvious when they're being met. And it's also obvious when they're not being met, so much so that I've had students who have been promoted by other people and then come back into the gym, and people have been like, hey, you didn't promote so-and-so, did you? I'm like, no. They're like, okay, we didn't think so, but man, whew. Like, it's that obvious, right? Like, so I do think that standards for rank can actually be incredibly clear. But to do that, you have to have an honest investment in not being the person who holds all the cards.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the unifying thread.
And I think most instructors don't have that. They want to be able to wield that power over their affiliation or association or their gym or whatever, where it's like, what I say goes, and, like they don't have any particular interest in divesting themselves of that.
Yeah, I think if there's one thing that we can agree on, and that really hopefully everyone agrees on, it's that in a world where exactly what a black belt means is not clearly defined universally, you should definitely not look at a black belt as an immediate symbol that someone is right when they're sharing their expertise with you, because there's so many limitations and caveats around that for the reasons we've talked about here. And additionally, the thing is too, there's a beginner's mind factor, right? Once you've been training for a long time, your mind does kind of become sort of rigid and closed to new information. And it's an active fight to put your ego aside and challenge your existing ideas. So when you see someone who is sharing an idea with you and their justification is simply, well, because I'm the black belt, if that's the best they can do, that is authority bias in action. And that is where someone is basically trying to win an argument with rank or title versus actual merit. And that's something that usually is a red flag that your instructor might be a little bit full of it, and you should maybe consider looking for information elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to follow up on the biases, if we're going to talk about logical fallacies, the argument from authority is another fallacy, but I think people sometimes misunderstand the fallacy, because I've seen so many people be like,
oh, I know exactly where this is going and I'm excited. Go for it. Go for it. Go for it.
Yeah. Like, well, one thing that drives me crazy is when like people who have, little to no understanding of logical fallacies start throwing around the terms and they actually don't even know what the hell they mean. And so like when one of these morons thinks that the argument from authority is that you are using an authority when you make an argument, that's not what it is, you fucking half-wits. If I use an epidemiologist as my reference point and their opinion on epidemiology as part of my argument, that's not an argument from authority. If I use the fact that somebody is a doctor for my argument about the stock market, that's an argument from authority.
Yeah, I was trying to educate someone on this a while ago because I've seen this a lot recently where you cite a very, very reputable source and people will say, oh, well, that's an argument from authority, isn't it? Isn't that authority bias? You're just saying that because the authorities say so. That is not what authority bias and argument from authority are about. Argument from authority is when you cite something or you believe something solely because an authority said it.
Yeah.
Now, the reality is, if you are doing your research properly and you know what you're talking about, most of the time when you're citing information and you're sharing it, it should come from an authority because odds are authorities are going to be experts and experts are going to be more likely to know what they're talking about and have the right data. So if you're doing things right, most of the time, your arguments will come from experts. Not all the time, but most of the time. It is only an argument from authority if the only argument you're making is this expert said so. Yeah. Really, the argument that you are trying to make should be based on what the expert has said and the validity of that argument, not their title or rank. That is where the difference lies. And that's where I've noticed a lot of people get confused now. And I think that the argument from authority fallacy is really the favored weapon of people who are trying to cast doubt on trusted institutions because they'll basically say, oh, well, you said the media said this. That's an argument from authority. Not necessarily. Or you said a doctor said this. That's an argument from authority. No, not necessarily, right? The message and the messenger are very different factors. And it is only an argument from authority if you're making a claim simply because an expert said it and for no other reason.
Or a perceived, and like a lot of times it's somebody who isn't an actual expert on the thing that you're talking about. So like I said, it's somebody who is an authority, but they're not an authority in the specific thing that you are trying to make claims about.
Yeah, you give a great example the last time you were on the show with us where you were talking about how, like, if you're in the military, well, that doesn't necessarily mean you're a great sniper. And maybe if you are a great sniper, you don't want to ask that person for advice on something that is completely unrelated to their area of expertise. And I think that is the thing, right? When you are a novice at something, you don't understand how deep the rabbit hole goes, right? You don't understand that just because so-and-so is an expert, that means they're an expert in this very narrow area. And the funny thing about expertise is usually to become a true expert at something, you have to narrow your focus a lot because you simply can't divide your time amongst a bunch of different things and actually achieve world-leading expertise in any of them. If you want to be a true expert in something, you have to sort of give it your undivided attention. So what you wind up seeing is that experts usually have very specific areas of expertise. And that's why you can get into a lot of trouble when, for example, someone speaks out of turn about something that is outside of their wheelhouse. And again, for the uneducated or the person who doesn't understand the lay of the land, it can be very hard for them to know when they're talking to someone who is within their circle of competence or not.
Yeah, have you seen the movie Good Will Hunting?
I have, long time ago, but yes, I've seen it.
So there's a quote there's the mathematician that figures out that Will Hunting is a genius, right? He's played by Stellan Skarsgård. And at one point he says to Will, there are maybe 4 or 5 people in the world that can tell the difference between me and you. He goes, but unfortunately, I'm one of them. So that's my way of, like, whenever I have to explain to somebody that sometimes you've actually got to be within, again, like it's the idea that a newbie can't tell the difference between a blue belt and a black belt based on like with some fields of expertise, you would literally have to be one of a handful of people in the world to actually know that one guy knows 10 times more than another guy.
Yeah. It's something that Oliver Taza said when he was on our show, where he was talking about like how there are levels of competition or just levels in general, right? And the stratosphere between those levels is like completely game changing, to the point where in order to move from one stratosphere to another, you need to completely rethink your entire life. I mean, with jujitsu as an example, right? Anyone can just show up to jujitsu and casually roll. But if you want to get to black belt, like really regardless of how you define what a black belt is, we all have to admit that like if you're going to get to black belt, you have to at least make a level of life commitment to jujitsu that most people would find odd, right? Then going beyond that, if you want to be a competitor, that's a totally different stratosphere. You have to restructure your life goals because you're simply not going to be able to achieve at a certain level unless you can devote enough of your time to the exclusion of other activities. And man, you go beyond that to like the world elite level, and these people live their lives completely different, right? Because they might have entire teams that exist to serve that one person and get them where they need to go. It's just a completely different way of living your life beyond just this person's just a little bit better. And that's a tricky thing with expertise, because you can have people who are both experts on the same thing. And to the layperson, it might appear that they're the same, but one of them might be like world class, whereas the other one might just be like a local college grad. Right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the challenges with expertise, is that it's not all created equal.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like that's why it's so important for people to really just understand what we're talking about. The same way, like if you're a jiu-jitsu person, which, if you're not, why are you listening to this podcast? But if you're a jiu-jitsu person, after a while, you're going to know exactly what you were just talking about. This idea that there are levels to this. Right? Like there are black belts, and then there are black belts, and then there are, like there are god tier black belts that strangle other black belts who absolutely annihilate the level of tier black belt below them, and so on and so on. So like there are absolutely levels to this, and we don't have a problem with that because we're so involved in the sport and this is interesting to us. But when we're not involved in the sport and we're looking at something else, they'll evaluate on the same level. There's those two like hack debunked doctors from LA that were putting out some like, COVID's not that big a deal video, and they'll put them on the same level as Anthony Fauci. Like it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, that's the exact example I was thinking, where those two doctors are absolutely experts in their field.
Yeah.
But there's two considerations there. One is their field is not epidemiology. They may be doctors. I believe they were like physicians, but they're not epidemiologists. And the other is, I believe those were like two guys who had a private clinic, and Anthony Fauci is maybe one of the most accomplished epidemiologists of our lifetimes, right? In terms of what he's achieved. So there's levels to expertise, right? It would be like me trying to call bullshit on John Danaher or something. I mean, to a white belt, they might not be able to distinguish between the two of us, but anyone who has an idea of how deep the rabbit hole goes will immediately see the difference.
Yeah. So like I would encourage people to spend a little bit of time. I mean, maybe we're trying to get to the point now where we're talking about actionable steps here.
Definitely.
Yeah. Is just spend a little time like in anything that you're interested in getting some level of real world knowledge. And like if you want to form an educated opinion on something, first of all, if it's in any way related to somewhere where you can get easy information from talking heads on YouTube, don't do that. It's the same problem that we have in jiu-jitsu, where people like they're white belts, they go on YouTube and they learn some fucking horse shit. Nowadays, the situation is actually a lot better, because back in the day, most of the stuff on YouTube was from hacks. Nowadays, a lot of the stuff on YouTube is just really good black belts teaching good stuff. So that's actually become that's something I'm actually pretty happy about, where the proliferation of YouTube jiu-jitsu has actually led to better people putting out information on jiu-jitsu on YouTube. That is not the case right now when it comes to politics. Mm-hmm. It's not the case when it comes to a lot of things. So politics is probably the best one I can pick, because it's the one that it's the topic that right now has the lowest level of discussion. Like the people who are mostly talking about politics on YouTube are the equivalent of like back in the day RE submissions 101 level type shit.
Ironically, we are those politics people right now because
yeah, we totally are, right? Like we don't know, which is why I'm not trying to suggest any particular course of action other than like if you want to educate yourself about this kind of stuff, actually educate yourself. Don't watch fucking YouTube political commentators. They're the worst. Get an actual idea of what political science is. Have an idea of what the words left and right actually mean. When you hear people in the United States talking about radical left wing, it's so fucking idiotic.
It's
because
preposterous.
There basically is no left wing other than some fringe, like whatever. I'm not like for the actual political parties that hold any meaningful sway over most people's lives in America. There is no left wing. There's a center-right party and a far-right party. If you go to any other country on the planet, what is referred to as radical left wing is just really centrist politics. So like the education that most people are getting on politics from YouTube, especially if it's American politics and American YouTube political commentators, it's so bad. It's such complete and utter garbage. Don't do that. Get yourself some actual political science books. Again, if you want to study a specific political policy that was implemented, you can actually study it. You can look at, okay, this happened, and then find a reputable social scientist, find some replicable studies that were done. And again, there are all kinds of issues, that plague our society that have been studied by scientists that have pretty in-depth information where you will see that there isn't a really clear, okay, this right-wing idea totally works and that quote-unquote left-wing idea totally doesn't. It's like you said, sometimes under certain circumstances this works and sometimes under other circumstances this works. And then there are things that are much more frequently like, this type of policy, which, some people would call left wing, but only in America, overwhelmingly works because it's been so well studied, because we've studied the effects of these policies and what they do and all that kind of stuff. So study the policies themselves and study the actual effects of the policies and what the science on them says. And you will start to be able to distinguish between the rhetoric and the bullshit that's being thrown at you to try to turn you into a mindless zombie who just votes party lines and all that kind of crap. So and this goes for anything, you want to get, I'm getting into car racing nowadays. So
you sure are.
Luckily, because there isn't this, the same level of, ridiculous nonsense. Like, I remember when I was a kid, my buddy who is the sort of person, my former buddy, who is the sort of person who would fall for this kind of, and has fallen for this kind of like binary political thinking. He was Chevys are great and Dodge and Ford is bad, or like American cars are great and Japanese cars are crap. And I remember my other friend, who is still my friend, and like, man, all these years I've been buying these shitty old American cars instead of just buying a Japanese car that was totally reliable because I listened to my idiot friend who told me that, so that was his version of an expert. And so I mean, man, there are all kinds of solutions out there. As a car guy, I like certain cars. And the more I learn about cars, the more I'm like, oh, well, I could actually totally see myself driving this car that I wouldn't have thought of before because I just thought that, these kinds of cars were good and cars that came from here were good for this and other cars are good. And all of that stuff is bullshit. If you go to people who actually know what they're talking about, they're just like, it's just a tool. Have you seen the movie Ronin?
No, I haven't. The Keanu Reeves one?
No, sorry. That's the 47 Ronin. Ronin is a movie with Robert De Niro.
Oh, no. I haven't seen it.
Oh my God. You should see it. It's great.
The Keanu Reeves one?
This guy,
or the Robert De Niro one?
The Robert De Niro one. Not the Keanu Reeves one. Robert De Niro plays this old-ish, compared to the other people in the movie. He's a very experienced, expert, field operative. And he's brought into this team of mercenaries to do a job. And there's this guy in there. He's played by Sean Bean, which, by the way, doesn't spoil the fact that character dies. Usually Sean Bean is that guy definitely dies. But this character played by Sean Bean, who is pretending to be an ex-SAS officer, and he's talking a lot of smoke. And he's talking about guns and like, you know, what kind of gun do you think is the best gun and this kind of thing. And De Niro just kind of shrugs and looks at him like the idiot that he is. He's like, whatever. It's just a tool. You get the right tool for the job. Like, it doesn't fucking matter, right? Like, as long as it does the job, right? So that, like, you want your ideas and your beliefs about the world to be tools that do the job. If all they do is protect this ridiculous sense of self that you have, then they're actually really bad at doing the job. You don't have the ability to effectively interact with the world, and you're just bringing everyone else down with your stupidity. So develop this ability to look at ideas and policies and, you know, notions or whatever as they're just tools. So if you want to learn about what's the most effective tool for this, go to the people who know the most about how to use those tools. Like, it's hard to go wrong that way.
Absolutely. And another thing that I would add, I mean, you talked about just the sheer prevalence of content that's out there, which is a blessing and a curse. I read this article by David Perel, and he called this the paradox of abundance.
Yes.
And basically what he says is that, like, the average quality of information is getting worse, but the best stuff is getting better, because we're in a market of abundance where there's so much stuff out there. So what this means is that, like, the median level of quality is way down because the barrier to entry is so low. But because of the sheer volume of it, the best stuff is absolutely going to be world class. And you see this, I mean, you talked about like YouTube videos. That's the greatest example. I can't imagine a much less of a barrier to entry. So one thing that you can do if you want to really, really identify where good quality content is find a place where there's a quality gatekeeper, basically someone whose job is to make sure that no one gets through the door unless a certain level of quality has been achieved. And that can be tricky to do, especially in today's world. But otherwise, it does become very, very hard to separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to identifying who really knows their stuff. So any effective shortcut you can use to gauge quality, such as, like, is there a gatekeeper in place? That winds up mattering a lot, because otherwise there's just so much noise out there that you'll never get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is one of these Herculean tasks that if you assign this level of, like, effort to everything in our lives, then it's impossible, right? Like, if you want to try to find out who all the, you know, the best experts are in every single thing that you do, you're not going to be able to do it, which is why, again, generally speaking, we're pretty much, like, for the most part, we are presented in a lot of things with pretty reliable experts. But if you're in doubt, there's a pretty easy way to find out. You know, we've been talking about these things so far. I would just encourage people to, like, if it's going to be something that matters, you know, if you're going to spend $100, $200, or maybe sometimes more dollars a month on a hobby like jiu-jitsu, find out enough about it that you don't walk into some shitty place. If you're going to vote, for fuck's sake, find out enough about the political process that you don't throw your vote away. Although, I mean, I would argue, unfortunately, in a lot of countries, that no matter who you vote for, you're pretty much throwing your vote away. But more recently, it's become clear that even if it's between two bad options, one of them is much, much worse than the other. So it's still something you should get informed about. You know, if you're going to go, like, you know, I've had a couple of knee surgeries. I did a crap ton of research on the doctors, and the process. And just anything that really matters in your life where you want an effective result. And effective doesn't mean the result that makes you the most comfortable. You know, the most effective result. Like, be as ruthlessly honest with yourself as you can be, which again is just, that's just something that I try to the extent that I'm comfortable giving people life advice, which is not very. If you can develop the habit of being ruthlessly honest with yourself and seek out information that's contrary to your, you know, existing belief system, and have people around you who, and this is really important because, again, in jiu-jitsu, especially once you've been at jiu-jitsu for a while, you know, I've talked about this before, when you're a jiu-jitsu instructor, there are any number of people that are just going to pump your tires in a way that's not justified. You can surround yourself with a gaggle of blue belts that tell you that you're the fucking greatest. It is really, really important to make sure that you are receiving contrary information and that you have people in your circle that will give you contrary information. And if you can't handle that, again, that's revealing something about you. It's revealing that you are not being honest with yourself.
Yeah, if you're in a room with everyone who's agreeing with you and pumping you up, that should actually scare you because it means that no one is really giving you honest feedback. There should always be some degree of dissent or some degree of critical feedback. And if everyone is always aligned all the time and everything is always hunky-dory, that doesn't mean that everyone is right. It just means that people are not being honest with each other.
Yeah, and the flip side to that is if everybody around you is disagreeing with you and you are not changing your mind, that might be the sign that there's some limitations to your thinking.
If you are like the lone dissenter and everyone else is like demonstrably proving that your way might be wrong. Like, I mean, if one person disagrees with you, that's life. If two people disagree with you.
Well, it's like that saying that, like, you know, if you meet an asshole and if you meet one asshole throughout your day, you met an asshole. If you meet a bunch of assholes, then you're the asshole.
Exactly. So it's an important thing to understand. The other thing I would also suggest is to, there's a great quote from Paul Graham where he says, keep your identity small. And you gave some great examples of this, right? If you have various things tied up in your ego and sense of self-worth and self-identity, like your political leanings, or in the context of jiu-jitsu, your gym affiliation or your belt rank. Like, if you look at these things as being part of who you are, it's going to influence your decision-making because you're going to look for things that confirm to your existing biases and beliefs. So it is better to try to detach yourself from those labels. You know, I think a big part of the issue that we see in the US right now is that people think of themselves as either left or right. And that's a very, very dichotomous way of thinking. And as we said at the beginning of the show, I think a far better label would be, do you think critically or do you not? And that is divorced from political parties entirely. That's just a way of thinking. And really, I think that's a far healthier thing.
Yeah, I wish more people would understand this about science, is that science is just a method for accumulating and assessing information, and it is self-correcting.
It's just a tool and a process. That's all it is. It does not have an agenda. It does not have political leanings. It is just a tool and a process for discovering information. Anyone can use it, regardless of what your political leanings are, your gym affiliation. Like, the tools for learning should be constant. And really, the only two categories of people in the world that matter are those who learn and those who don't. Well, I think that was a great chat. I learned a lot. Hope everyone else definitely learned a lot. I mean, this, I think, as everyone knows, is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. Cognitive biases, mental models, logical fallacies, this kind of stuff.
Oh, you know what? If I can add one little parting thought.
Go for it.
If at any point you are now, having listened to this, sitting down to send hate mail to Steve or myself, you are literally one of the morons we have described. You are one of the people that, because we insulted some sacred cow that you have, are now getting their knickers in a twist to the point where you're sending an angry email. Then you're the problem.
But that said, I do enjoy those emails.
Oh, of course. They're hilarious.
You know,
but
the one thing that I find, Rob, and I mean, you tell me if you've experienced the same. I mean, we try to keep the show mostly like on the straight and narrow and objective. But that said, we do every once in a while, we upset someone and we hear about it. What I have found is the people who have legitimate questions, they'll send me like a 1, maybe 2 paragraph email. But the people who are mad will like send me their life story.
Oh,
and
God.
I'm reading this and I'm like, I wasted your whole day here, man. Like, you were so upset about this that you wrote like a whole book chapter to read me out about.
I mean, like, maybe I'm jinxing myself by saying this, but I personally haven't really received any hate mail, like on, at least as far as like I know on a couple of the podcasts that I did with Stefan, he got some comments. Like, I got a couple of death threats in some YouTube comments. But as far as like people who either have listened to, like, you know, subscribers of my online academy, or people who have interacted with me on Instagram or anything like that, I have not gotten any sort of hate mail. So maybe my audience are just not the type of morons that send hate mail to quasi-public figures. So,
or maybe they're busy driving to your house right now. It could be that. Yeah, I hope that everyone who listens to this understands that, like, the whole purpose of this conversation is not to shit on whatever beliefs you have, but rather to talk about how detaching your thinking from those beliefs and learning to assess sources of information independently and objectively, that's really what you need to be doing. Like, this is not about trying to shit on anyone's personal feelings or their opinions. It's just a matter of talking about ways to objectively think and make decisions.
Yeah, and when you get to the point where you can do that, you will be able to very effectively shit on people's stupid opinions.
Yeah, that is the thing. Like, if you really want to shit on people's opinions, what better way than to understand critical thinking?
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that was an awesome chat, Rob. Again, thank you so much for your time and making yourself available. I know that this is an area of passion for myself and also for you. And I hope that everyone out there who listened got something valuable out of this. As always, any questions or comments, please do write in. Rob, anything you want to talk about or to share with us before we go?
God, at this point, no, I just want to go to sleep.
Fair enough. Do you want to plug your academy?
Oh, sure. Yeah. My online academy, because my brick and mortar academy, no one can come visit it right now. But yeah, bjjconcepts.net if you want if you want a nice mix of conceptual jiu-jitsu, pretty in-depth technical instruction, a unique resource for developing your instruction skills, like your ability to teach. We call it the pedagogy section, and quite a vast collection of dick jokes interspersed throughout that.
You don't say.
If you enjoy that sort of thing, then check out bjjconcepts.net. And when things do get back to normal, please come and visit Island Top Team on Vancouver Island in Nanaimo in Canada, because man, I miss having visitors. It's really, I got to roll with fucking Rory all the time, and it's just terrible.
We had him on the podcast, and I was actually shocked by how many people enjoyed listening to him. Like the amount of positive feedback I got kind of blew me away. I mean, this is Rory, but I guess that's that whole internet expert thing, right? You make one Stephen Kesting DVD and then everyone just loves you.
Yeah, exactly. But please, for those of you that are ever interested, I do have, when travel is okay, I do have a visiting student program at my academy. Anybody from any academy in the world is welcome to come and visit for a week, and you can stay for free with me at my place. I've got a home with a few extra bedrooms that I host visitors all the time. So yeah, and you can train at the academy. So once things get back to normal, please hit me up. Although we'll probably have a bit of a waiting list. I had to cancel a bunch of visits as shit went sideways back in March, and now I've got people that have contacted me and are like, hey, when things get back to normal, can I visit? So we may not be able to get you in right away, but we will find space for you. I love having visitors. I love meeting new people. I love talking about ideas. I've actually, in case you can't tell, we've been talking about this shit for almost 2.5 hours. I have stayed up for a couple hours talking to people about stuff. It forces me to interact with human beings in a way that doesn't involve me being a jiu-jitsu instructor on the mats where people are obviously like listening to what I say. So it's one of the things, it's one of the tools that I use to try to undercut, any kind of cognitive biases that I might be, guilty of, because we all are. Like, one of the worst things that you can do is, you learn about cognitive bias and you think that it doesn't apply to you.
Oh yeah. That's the thing. It's like when people say, I'm not racist. It's like, yes, you are. Everyone is. It's a cognitive bias. It's exactly. If you deny its existence, you can't do anything about it. We have to accept and understand these things if we want to actually take action. And that's why it's so important to understand these cognitive biases, because awareness is the single best tool for combating them and therefore making better decisions.
Yeah, but awareness alone doesn't do it. You have to have a protocol in place that is outside of your own personal thought process, because you will still be vulnerable to these cognitive biases. And the more isolated you are from, again, opposing views, the more power you have. There's a reason there's that saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, is that no one is above it. And so part of my process for preventing cognitive biases, or not preventing, but from dealing with cognitive biases and for being exposed to different ideas, is that when I've got visitors at my home, if they have a particularly interesting view, if they've got interesting life experience, I get to meet really fascinating people who know a lot more than I do about whatever things that they know about. And I get to talk to them and I get to be educated and I get to, and I sit there and I'm not the authority in the room. I'm not the guy that everyone's listening to. I'm the guy who's listening to someone else. And we might even have, a debate about something that I happen to believe in, and maybe they have a different view, and I'll be able to change my mind on something because the information that I had didn't have the same level of expertise behind it as the information that they have. So, I've had some wonderful book recommendations from some of my visiting students that I've been able to, change my views on certain things as a result of those books. So yeah, anyway, this has become a thing about my visiting student program. So yeah,
there's a plug.
Check any of that stuff out. islandtopteam.com is my school's website. bjjconcepts.net or .com will take you to my online academy if you want to give me money.
Awesome. And if you want to give me money, bjjmentalmodels.com. Specifically on the Patreon, we give away a ton of stuff on there. In addition to getting the episodes in advance, we also have a lot of exclusive content and educational material. We actually just finally, after getting badgered nonstop for a year and a half about this, put all of our stuff into a book, and it's up there in PDF and EPUB format. So join us on Patreon and you can get that. Rob, I think that was a great chat. If it's okay with you, why don't you go to sleep and I'll go and talk shit to people on the internet.
Yeah, I definitely got the best part of that. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I'm going to go and pretend to be a COVID expert. All right, I'll talk to you later, man.
All right, take care.
Take care. Bye.